This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. Today I'm here with Pastor Chris Kopp at Changepoint Church in downtown Anchorage. And this is this the largest church in Anchorage? I've heard that it is.
Yes, yep, it's the largest church in Alaska actually.
Largest church in Alaska. And what's your position at Changepoint right now?
So I'm the pastor of discipleship here, which is a fairly new position for me here.
So it's a bit of, you're still figuring out your role.
I'm still very much figuring it out.
How new is it?
We got here in July.
July?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just 4 months or so.
Yeah, about 4 months, yep.
Okay. And you have some extensive experience in Alaska, and several people came to me and said, you should talk to Chris Kopp, and specifically about the topic of what is the current state of the church in Alaska. And you've developed a reputation for having good knowledge on that. You've even done research on that. So I asked you if you'd sit down with me, and you said yes. So Thank you for sitting down with me today.
Absolutely.
Sure. So before we jump into it, tell me briefly about who is Chris Kopp and what is your experience in Alaska?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an Alaska kid. I grew up here in Alaska, moved out of Alaska in the mid-'90s and went to Louisiana. Was there for 16 years, did youth ministry and church planting there before God called us back to Alaska. And we've been serving in the village of Galena, which is a rural Alaskan village, for the last 12 and a half years until God called us to leave that and come serve on staff here at Changepoint. If Galena's if you draw a straight line from Fairbanks to Nome, Galena is the halfway point of that line. So it's a fly-in only community. Mm-hmm. And I served as the pastor of the only Protestant church in a village of about 500 for about 12 and a half years.
Wow, okay. Yeah, and I've been to Galena myself a few times. And if you look at a map of Alaska, you just poke your finger right in the middle.
Yep.
That's about where Galena is.
That's just about it, yeah.
So you're right in the middle of the interior there.
Yep. Great,
okay. So let's go ahead and jump into this topic of the current state of Alaska. You and I were talking briefly before I hit record about there's a distinction between sort of the on-road system church and then the off-road system church. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so Alaska is an odd entity in the sense that there's most of Alaska, 90+% of Alaska, you can't drive to, right? You have to fly out to it. And so this little bit of road that connects the major urban hubs of Alaska that, have your major box stores and your chain restaurants and those kind of things, versus the vast majority of Alaska being these rural, isolated, fly-in only or boat-in only kind of communities that are across the gambit of it. And so what it creates is kind of this dichotomy of Christian engagement, of church engagement, because road system churches, you can find just about any flavor of, church that you want to have. You want to have a contemporary church, you want to have a traditional church, you want to have a particular denomination. If you're in Anchorage or Fairbanks, you can find all of those things as an option, an opportunity, and even multiples of those kind of things. But when you go out to the rural context, it becomes much more of, on a spiritual plane, it becomes much more of a desert. Like maybe you might find something in that place. So as an example, the Koyukon region where we served for the last 12 and a half years, there were 9 Koyukon villages in our region, and of those there were 3 that had evangelical churches planted in them. And so, you literally would boat past village after village after village before you got to a village where there was an evangelical church or Protestant church at. And so I always equate it with people of saying, when you drove to church this morning, how many churches did you drive past to get to your church? And you don't perceive that in the sense of driving past communities to get to a place where there was a church. So I think it's just something that people don't have a perspective of really in Alaska, that dichotomy.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And also out there, when you talk about quote unquote, driving by villages.
Yeah,
You're
right.
talking about taking a boat down the Yukon,
Yeah,
basically,
right. Yeah.
and you're passing villages every maybe 40 or 50 miles or
Yes,
something
right.
like that. And so even there's a isolation aspect to these villages,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to pass many of them before you finally get to some sort of church. Now, isn't it the case that there might be villages that have believers in it, but
Yes.
no church, and that's pretty common, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, just to say that a church or that a village doesn't have a church doesn't mean there's not any believers in it. But taking a distinct form of saying, so what is a church? What makes something a church versus, say, a Bible study or a prayer group or something along those lines. It may very well be that there's one family that's in a village that's following Jesus, and in the very loosest sense of definition of church, you could say, well, anywhere where there's a follower of Jesus, there's a church. And I would say, yes, but there also are some distinctives that the scriptures teach about what is a church and how does it function and what's its purpose and how does it carry out ordinances and communicating the gospel and all of those kind of things. So to say that there's a believer in a village doesn't necessarily constitute that there is a church in that village.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So let's talk about, you talked about you pastoring a church in Galena.
Yeah.
Are there any other churches that you know of with like elders and leadership and, some sort of organization that you know of in the interior villages?
Yeah, in the interior villages, there's the two villages that were near us that had kind of sister churches to us was the village of Ruby and the village of Huslia. The church in Ruby, Ruby Community Church, Ruby Bible Church, was actually the mother church that planted Galena Bible Church back in the 80s.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and just kind of said, hey, Galena needs a church that's preaching the gospel, and so they were part of planting that. And then there was a couple, Don and Brenda Ernst, that moved into the village of Huslia and worked for about 25 years planting that church that was there. And I remember asking Don, because it's one of the only new churches that I found in rural Alaska in the last 30 years. And I asked Don how they did it, and he said, well, we came doing children's and youth ministry, and we stayed long enough that they were adults. And I said, that's not fast. So, normal church planning models kind of, don't work really great in a rural setting.
And what has been generally, we'll speak in generalities.
Sure.
Because I think in the Western world, the Western missionaries, we tend to think about efficiency.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And are you very critical of that?
Yeah, I am. Because, efficiency is very much a Western world view and a mindset. So we as Westerners, we think in terms of time as a line, right? Like it's a ever ongoing, next event, next plan, and it just goes straight. Mm-hmm. And rural Alaska doesn't think in a line; it thinks in a circle.
Yes.
Time is seasonal. It's, right now it's the beginning of winter, and the things that you do at the beginning of winter, 50 years from now, you're going to be doing those same things. And so the way in which forward progress happens doesn't happen linearly. It happens in some ways a little bit like a tire slipping on ice. It does move forward, but it's not moving forward very very fast. And so the kind of just expectation of, all right, you're going to get in and you're going to accomplish these tasks, and this many believers are going to be there, and they're going to be trained up in this way, and the building's going to be built, and the congregation is going to be established, and use the planter will leave, and that'll be 7 years. And you go, and what do you do in a context where maybe the local folks, because people have cycled in and out so fast over the years in their expectation, are going like, I'm not even going to remember your name until year 3, let alone let you have any deep conversations with me. So so I think expectations of what have been put forward by kind of corporate Christianity are not necessarily realistic of rural Alaska.
So if a missionary was to come to Alaska, or maybe even the term missionary is someone from the outside, but maybe better from someone from a church on the road system to go out because they know Alaska better. But anyway, what should be their mindset? You go into a new village. We want to plant a church. We want to see the gospel proclaimed. What should their mindset be?
Yeah, so the thing that I've always encouraged folks to think about is whenever you're doing your ministry plans, which I think ministry plans are good, but they need to evaluate whether or not it has two certain factors. Does it have enough time, and does it have enough relationship? Because those two things, if the quotients of those parts in the equation are too small, it's not going to actually do anything. And so there is just no way to substitute time and the quantity of time. And then simultaneously, there's no way to substitute anything other than relationship. So you have to be there long enough and have enough relationship. And this is not in the sense of like, road system communities saying like, hey, we want to do a block party so that we can get to know our neighbors and that kind of a thing. That dynamic of relationship really is an element of trust. It's an element of vulnerability, and it just takes a lot of time and relationship to actually see any discipleship fruit born out of engagement with folks in rural Alaska.
Yeah, and so it's got to be much more relationally based than maybe a typical Western church might be used to,
right.
And less program based and less rushed.
Right.
Taking your time, building that trust over time.
Yeah.
So patience is a virtue in Alaska.
Yeah, very much.
It was true, and I lived in Mexico.
Yeah.
I worked with it was a very remote indigenous tribes and in adobe huts and all of that. Yeah. And time was not treated like a commodity like we Westerners do. And I would literally sit all day with a cup of coffee with a guy, and we would say 2 words to each other in 8 hours. I'm like, why am I even here?
Yeah.
I'm so bored.
Right.
But that guy was having the time of his life.
Yeah, yeah.
And you really have to change your mindset of, the idea of I want to produce fruit and I want to perform to I'm slowing down, I'm just sitting here with people.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point. Okay, so I'm really curious about where did you mentioned at 80% without a gospel presence. Could you explain where you got that number and what does that mean?
Yeah, so I remember years back when we first moved to the village, and I just began kind of asking some of those kind of missiological questions about trying to study the culture and study the context and figure out, what is it that we're up against? And people kept throwing around this kind of like 80% of villages don't have a gospel, or don't have a Christian presence or whatever. And my anecdotal experience of that seemed like, okay, well, it seems like that's probably true, but I don't know that I have any actual empirical data to prove that as a point. So we started doing some research to try to actually quantify that in some reality. So we set our scope, asking the question, okay, what communities are we not studying? So there's some rural places that are more research posts than villages. So scratching those off and then saying things like, Tok and Delta Junction that are on the road system, but are rural, do those count in the thing? And so we identified kind of what places we were actually going to be looking at. And then we began to look at what we called accessible data. So basically things you could Google. So where do Catholics say that they are? Where do Mormons say that they are? Where do the Baha'i say that they are? Where are Baptists? Where are Methodists? Where are all these kind of things? And so using just an Excel spreadsheet, literally just started pulling up the data and saying, okay, they say they're in these 6 villages. They say they're in these 13 villages. Mm-hmm. And so started getting all of that accessible data. Mm-hmm. But as we were doing that, we also began to realize that, wait, I've been to that village and they say that there's something there. And I know that there's a building there, but I know that nobody uses that building unless it's like a funeral or a wedding or something like that. And so when we started realizing, okay, well, that means that there's some unaccessible data or some data that's assumed, because nobody likes to say, oh yeah, we used to be in that place, but we're not in that place anymore, so we're going to take it off the website, kind of a thing. And so started to actually research some more reality of, is there a body that, or was there a church that was there back in the 40s or the 50s, but man, there's nobody been meeting there. There's no congregation that's functioning there for the last 30 years.
Is that a pretty common thing that, a church back in the 40s is no longer congregating? Is that pretty common?
Yeah, very common.
Okay.
And so once we kind of gathered that stuff, then we basically went through a grid of saying, okay, from a Protestant / evangelical, very specific, like a kind of a little bit more of a narrow gospel kind of picture of saying, okay, who do we believe is actually we can say is preaching a gospel that we could get behind, them, whether we agreed with their ecclesiological stance on practice of what kind of elders, what kind of governance of church or whatever. They're preaching the same gospel that we are, and began looking at that and carving off some of those kind of things. And so we could say that with certainty, our conservative estimate is that 80% of the villages don't have a gospel-believing planted church in it, and our more probably realistic numbers is that it's bumping pretty close to 90% don't have a gospel-believing planted church. And so distinctly defining those kind of things. Because the reality of what we were looking at is saying, if we're saying, hey, we want to see a church planted in every village, well, you got to be precise about what some of those things are and know what you're aiming for, because you're only ever going to hit what you're aiming at.
Yeah. You can't just make vague statements and expect to accomplish something.
Right, yeah.
Yes. Okay, you mentioned that there's quite a few different denominations throughout Alaska, and not all of them are Protestant. There's Russian Orthodox and there's Catholic and a lot of non-Protestant.
Yep.
What does the relationship between these denominations look like throughout Alaska? I know that's a very open-ended question.
Yeah, very open-ended question. So I know that you've done a podcast series that I can't remember if it's coming before mine or after mine, but some of the history of that, and some of that plays into the present day reality of these things. That some of this stuff was things that is now 100 years old of mission / denominational efforts into these rural communities. And historically they kind of got divided up into regions, and they kind of said, hey, go send your missionary teachers into this area and don't send them over into this area. And some of that stuck and some of it didn't. Yeah. Some of it became cultural norm for so that people in that region would say, whether they attend the church or not, they would identify with that particular denomination, say on like a census data or something like that. And so, some of those classic historic ones that have been, literally working in that region for over 100 years, or things like the Moravians and the Evangelical Covenant or formerly Swedish Covenant denomination, things like the Quaker Church or the Friends Church, those kind of entities are still at play in those places now. They've got 100 years of engagement in that. They've got pretty mixed bag on whether or not they've grown or flourished, or whether they've been able to maintain generational handoff. So some of those, like the Moravian Church, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. I want to say it's like 19 villages that have Moravian churches in them. Most of those do not have a pastor. Most of those don't meet very regularly at all, unless maybe an itinerant comes through in those places. Most of those services are still done in Yupik. And so the challenge on that is that the younger generation doesn't speak Yupik as well as their parents or grandparents did. So when they go into church, they're just not picking up a lot of the stuff, and it doesn't connect with them as well. And a lot of their young pastors are in their mid to late 50s. Wow. Versus the Evangelical Covenant denomination, I think is kind of knocking it out of the park on engaging their young folks. But their churches are not necessarily thriving. But their parachurch side of their denomination, their kind of organized structure of how do we engage students and things like that, is just doing fantastic.
You mentioned the Evangelical Covenant Church. You said is thriving. Tell me about that. Why? What about them is different than the rest, that they are thriving and others are not?
Yeah. So, by my estimation, there's nobody in the state of Alaska that is doing as good of a job organizationally of engaging their young people and taking their young people from one stage to the next stage to the next stage. Within that denomination, they have what's called their Covenant Youth of Alaska. It's their kind of student ministry program, parachurch, but under a denomination, really. And it incorporates everything from their summer Bible camp that meets. It incorporates internships that they'll send interns to go do youth ministry in villages, even in villages where there is no pastoral leadership. And they'll serve in that kind of a capacity. They'll bring those kids out to retreats. And then once they get older, maybe once they either graduate from high school or something like that, they've got connections to Alaska Christian College, which is down in Soldotna, and which is a college you can get an associate's degree at. But they really see it as kind of this transitional point of helping people get from rural village living into some kind of sustainable life skill. And so lots of discipleship and lots of counseling and lots of one-on-one type of engagement. And then at the two other major colleges, UAA and UAF, and Anchorage and Fairbanks, they have Aragah House, which is their college house ministry thing, which is just college campus ministry. And so their terminology for it is, they call it their continuum of care. And it is just the way that they web them all the way through that process and are integrating that and giving them opportunities and on-ramps for leadership and training and those kind of things. And it's very indigenous. And it's very young person led, and it's doing really well for them.
That's really cool. I've heard a little bits and pieces, and so that's really helpful. And I know that makes me think of a lot of the Bible camps, because I provide transportation for several Bible camps throughout Alaska. The ministry is awesome. The kids go and they have a camp experience. They get away from whatever stresses they might have in the village, and they can be kids for a week, and they hear the gospel, very clear presentations of the gospel. And the Bible camps acknowledge this. We send the kids home, and we don't see them for another year. Right. And of course, sounds like the Evangelical Covenant Church has really picked that up and carried these kids through. Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. And I know I've been invited to Tenalia Bible Camp, or Tenalian.
Yeah, Tenalian Bible Camp.
Well, it's a leadership center, sure. And I know they also have a program like that as well that I've just been starting to learn about.
Yeah, so the Bible camps in Alaska is kind of another unique thing. I mean, a lot of American states have, Bible camps Christian summer camps. Some of them are denominationally driven. Some of them are, for-profit camps that put on really good programs for Christian kids. But Alaskan Bible camps have kind of a uniqueness in them, in that there are some road system ones, but there's actually quite a number of them that are really, really remote. And the one that you fly out to, I think the nearest village to it, I want to say, is like 60 or 70 miles away.
Yeah, that's right.
And you're boating down the Yukon, and all of a sudden there's this little bitty village that you think is a little bitty village, and it's not. It's a Bible camp. Yeah. And so there's a number of these around the state, and just depending on their leadership, depending on the vision of those folks that are running that there, they have kind of picked up on this reality of like, hey, we can engage these kids in pretty incredible ways for this week, whereas kids become just like super excited about going to camp. Going to camp becomes this huge thing. Yeah. But then those camps have either figured out, okay, how do we as a camp leadership structure and or how do we partner with a missionary organization or a denomination or something to do some of that follow-up kind of thing. So Changepoint actually has a camp that happens up in Kotzebue called Katavik Bible Camp, and a guy by the name of Lance Kramer runs that. Lance goes out and literally sets up wall tents for 2 weeks and has a junior high week and a high school week, packs the thing out, shares the gospel, and then they realized, like, man, we're sending these kids back and there's not anything for them. So their church service throughout the year has like 3 adults and like 15 to 20 kids, teenagers, that are coming, and that's church. And because they're saying we got to have something, following up on that. Tenalian Bible Camp is another great example of that. Birthed out of that was that Tenalian Leadership Center, which is kind of like a gap year ministry program of these kids that are aging out of high school but not really ready for adulting in that kind of sense. And so how do we disciple them? How do we teach them job skills things? How do we help them with some of the addiction and trauma and things like that they have, and kind of figuring out that care? And so again, I think the reason that those are working is going back to that time and relationship component of it. Of the part that Bible camps have is you got by themselves, you got lots of relationship. There's lots of relational capital. They're so excited to see you and all that kind of thing. But there's not time because it's just 1 week, and then it happens 1 week every summer. And so figuring out a way to bridge that time and relationship components together, I think is what I'm seeing bear some fruit in those things.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had. Like, because when I fly for these camps, I stay at the camp with my family, and that's what we talk about.
Yeah.
What do we do for the other 51 weeks of the year?
Right.
And it's kind of a big question mark. There are some things, there are some programs, as you pointed out, but there's still an incredible amount of need. Most of these kids do not get anything.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the big gaps, if you will, in Alaska, is for these young people. So I want to ask you kind of a $1 million question, if you will. Let's only speak in generalities, but what are Alaskan missionaries doing wrong in generally speaking here in Alaska? What are some things that we're not quite getting right?
Well, I think the field missionaries, ones that are actually living out in the field, by my estimation, are doing exactly what they should be doing.
Okay.
They're just walking in faithfulness. They're walking in time. They're walking in relationship. They're seeing that incremental moment by moment. It's not. It doesn't measure by success that a lot of modern Western metrics of success would look like, because it's not like, I baptized 15 people this year or whatever. It's like, I baptized one in the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. Not for lack of sharing the gospel, not for lack of those kind of things, but for all kinds of stuff. But that one was a hard-fought one. Yeah. And if that person hadn't have been there, it wouldn't have been one. Yeah. And so in that sense, I think they're doing a fantastic job in that sense. One of the challenges that, because I think we are pressing for those models of success and wanting to be able to see that, some of the Alaskan missionaries that I see that I do get kind of frustrated with are ones that actually aren't living in the places, but are just kind of parachuting in and doing an event and leaving, and then reporting, hey, here's to my supporters, here's what we, here's all the things in the numbers and the, whatever kind of a thing, and going, again, it's creating some relationship, but it's devoiding itself of some of that time. And so, so I think that, the challenge is there's not a lot of folks that want to go live in these hard to get to places where, a gallon of milk's $15, and, a trip to Lowe's is going to cost you $450 because you're going to have to fly there round and back or whatever. And so I think some of the challenge on that is really just pressing this point of going, the vast majority of these places don't have somebody living an exemplary Christ-like life to model the realities of this gospel that we're preaching. And so, the I guess push that I would be pushing people for is, I would say, well, what about you? What, is there a space in which God would give you a season at which God would say, I'll go spend the next 5 years of my life going and serving in this capacity, and just making a commitment to go and say, Lord, I may not see the whole village to come to Christ, but if I can see one, that would be worth it.
And finding someone, there's a lot of people willing to parachute in, as you say,
right,
but it's so hard to find someone who says, I will, I was talking with Adam London, we're doing the history of the church, and he was describing in the history missionaries that literally pack their things in their own coffin and go out to a village. Right. To find someone like that is just, 1 in a million kind of a thing. Right. And that's just the reality of what is needed in Alaska.
Right. Yeah, and it is so challenging. It's you're flying into a place. So if you're going to fly out of that place to go, say, serving in Galena, if we were going to go visit family down in the lower 48 or whatever, it doubled our cost and it doubled our travel time, because not only did I have to fly out of Alaska to that place, I had to fly out of my village to Road System, Alaska, to then catch the plane to fly out, and those kind of challenges became incredibly
and you can't send your kids to youth group or send them to the public school. There are some schools in the villages, but it's just it's a completely different life, and you're giving up a lot to be there. Right. And it's puts strain on yourself and your family and your marriage. Is just hard.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, there's the sheer number of those villages where those kids are coming from those Bible camps and things like that, that are void of any regular, ongoing discipleship opportunity. Are just, they're just vast, and so it really is too few folks scattered in those areas, and a lot of the rural, missionary folks kind of have found that medium between the two of plugging into, say, like a hub village versus a really small village, and because the hub village does have a little bit more resource, and it's the idea of like, okay, well, there's only one of me, so I'll be in this hub village, and then I'll try as much as I can to go connect with this village and this village and this village and this village, but again, you get the challenge of that time component, spent with people.
One thing I've realized since I've been in Alaska, I've only lived here 4.5 years, so I'm still kind of a newbie. Yeah. But I keep learning about more and more missionaries in different villages. Like I've never even heard that there was these missionaries in these villages over here. And there seems to be, at least in my experience so far, sort of a disconnect and a lack of missionary community. Various organizations have their missionaries and they stay in touch with each other, but across the state, I'm learning more and more. There's these little tiny organizations that send out individuals or families, and I'm beginning to learn about them. In your experience, have you kind of seen this? Like, there's a million little organizations in Alaska, and we kind of know about each other, but not that. Maybe we could do better. Have you experienced that?
Yeah. I mean, Alaska kind of lends itself to the maverick personality. I'll come do it by myself, and I'll accomplish the goal. And
is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do you think?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think it all again stems from motive. Am I a maverick because I think I'm better than everybody else, and I can do it better than everybody else, and so I'm going to do it by myself. Kind of a thing. Or is it, I'm a maverick because nobody else is willing to do it, so I'm going to go. I got the toughness to go do it. We do it in a place that nobody else has done. So again, it's a mix. It's a mixed bag. I think on that motive side of things. But yes, I think sometimes within the denominational world, they get kind of in their own echo chamber and they just play with their own folks that are in that kind of a field. There's a lot of independent missionaries that literally set up their own 501c3 and had their own board and raised their own funds, and they had nobody else around them, and they just went off and did their thing. There's missionaries that are with missionary sending agencies like Send North or Interact Ministries, and those do tend to have a little bit more interconnectiveness to themselves and have some shared life and ministry and that kind of a thing. And so it is kind of a mixed bag. There's really not very many organizations or events or things like that actually draw those missionaries together. So one of the few entities that I'm aware of that does that is Arctic Barnabas Ministries, and they're really one of the few organizations that intentionally plays with in a lot of people's basketball courts to try to draw the game together, and just draw people into relationship with each other. And so I mean, there definitely is there is a lot of, I think, room for improvement. But I mean, and again, the other challenge is the distances between these places and the cost of getting to those to have relationship with other missionaries. Is pretty challenging. So there are some churches in the state that have kind of stepped into that a little bit, and organizations. So the church in McGrath has started to do these regular rural gathering moments where they're trying to bring pastors and missionaries and just Christians from villages and stuff to these points of either a marriage conference or literally just a Christian get-together kind of thing.
Yeah, in fact, I just flew for one of those with Brad Sturm. Yep. In fact, I have an episode. It's like 2 episodes ago.
Nice.
Is Brad talking about his organization. Where he's drawing people in. And it's efforts like that, and Arctic Barnabas, you and I both attended the same, what do they call it, MFR?
Yeah, Missionary Family Retreat.
Yeah, excellent. Just an incredible amount of work goes into that.
Oh, yeah.
And that's really how I've met so many missionaries through that effort, and that unifying aspect of it, saying, hey, we're different organizations. Maybe we have slightly different theology and stuff, but let's gather and encourage each other. So, lots of praise for Arctic Barnabas and that event. And you and I got to chat there a little bit too.
Yep.
So, yeah, cool. I want to ask you about we talked about at the beginning, on-road system, off-road system.
Yeah.
On-road system, you mentioned you can drive by 4 churches and to get to your church.
Yeah.
Is the on-road church, are they doing a sufficient amount or like for their own state? I mean, what is that status?
Yeah. The road system is, hands down the lion's share of the population.
Yeah.
Right. When it comes to like Anchorage and Matsu Valley, well over half the population of the state is in those two, clustered communities.
Yeah.
Whereas the lion's share of the land mass is not on the road system, know. And so when you look at it as a whole, as a state as a whole, when you say what's the state of the church in Alaska, it's pretty dismal as far as number of people that regularly attend a church of any variety on any given Sunday versus the population of the state is like 6% or something like that. It's a very, very small. Alaska is one of the least church states in the United States.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
And yet, while simultaneously being one of the most culturally diverse states and then Anchorage being, one of the most culturally diverse cities in the United States. And so there's this tension or this challenge that it faces that, the road system churches are, they're in a bit of a struggle for themselves to just remain healthy and stay healthy like a church should be in the changing time of the world in which it is. But while simultaneously literally having missions at their doorstep. And for a lot of rural Alaska, not rural Alaska, but a lot of churches in Alaska, their view of missions immediately goes outside of Alaska. It immediately goes to, we're going to have a mission trip to India, or we're going to have a mission trip to Mexico, or we're going to have a mission trip to whatever. And honestly, in a lot of those situations, it's actually cheaper to go do a mission trip to those places than to get to some of these rural villages because of the cost of flying out to these rural villages.
I have an airplane and I have to pay to fly. It's a lot. Yeah.
It's a lot. And it's a long
Airlines
distance.
are cheaper.
Yeah. And so so there is kind of this tension of that a lot of folks that have grown up their entire life in Anchorage, that have been Christians their entire life and gone to church their entire life, have no idea what the mission field looks like in rural Alaska. It's just not ever, rural Alaska is just a reality show to them, not really necessarily viewed as a mission field.
Yeah, so it's perhaps not as much on our radar as perhaps we would like.
Right, yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, so I want to ask you about more about the current state of the church. Here we are, we're in the building of the largest church in Alaska, Changepoint. And there's, even as we look out the window, we could probably see within our purview a handful of smaller churches.
Right.
And you talked about the tension between the churches with our modern world is changing, and there's more resistance to, for lack of a better term, churches or religious activity. Yeah. So churches face that, but they also want to be outward focused. How does the church move forward? Like, you could start with specifically, what is Changepoint doing right now for the state of Alaska, and what can smaller churches do? Like, do they send out a missionary?
Right.
Do they send a team somewhere? Like, what can the modern church do?
Yeah, what can we do? Yeah, so the mission statement of Changepoint is life in Christ for every Alaskan and the world beyond. And so basically with the idea of saying, we just want to give everybody a fair shot at the gospel, whether they receive it or not. That's on every individual, right? But our obligation of followers of Jesus is to be obedient to the Great Commission, to go and make disciples, to at least be the evangelist, the one that tells the good news, and whether people believe it is the good news or not, obviously that's going to be on them. So one of the ways that God's been convicting Changepoint as a church, and one of the reasons why I was excited about stepping on to that was stepping into some of this rural engagement of saying, okay, how do we leverage our time, talents, and resources and our people and those kind of things to engage that? So very intentionally, they started partnering in Kotzebue for this engagement of students in that whole region and trying to engage a deep Christ follower in Lance and Karina Kramer that are up there, to see them leveraging their talents and resources for the purpose of reaching their own people in that place. And then here within the last couple of years, they've been partnering with Samaritan's Purse, who does a number of different things here in Alaska, in the village of Marshall. And we have an outpost that's there, and this precious godly couple that's there serving, kind of just keeping the church building, but functioning it as a kind of a teen center or children's center that's open 5 days a week for kids to come play games and do schoolwork and have a snack and have people that are there just loving them and pouring into them and encouraging on that. So, seeing that rally around in those kind of capacities has been really, really cool. The other aspect of it is just seeing the church body view itself in ethnically diverse ways and engagement. And so lifting up your eyes to the nations that get brought to you. A lot of people don't think about, when they think about missions, and they think about the buzzword in missions is unreached people groups, right? Like looking at people that are less than 2% evangelical as a definition of that. And most people don't realize that America has the third most unreached people groups that live in its borders.
Really? Wow.
So you think of reaching Somalians in Somalia. You don't think of reaching Somalis in Atlanta, Georgia.
That's interesting. I don't want to cut you off, but when I lived in Chicago, there was a man from South Africa. He came as a missionary to Chicago to plant a church, because of the data he wrote about the need for it.
Right.
And there's churches in Chicago, but apparently there was a big need for it, and I attended his church. And as Americans, we need to kind of swallow a humble pill and say we need missionaries ourselves. Right. And I'll point this out just because I'm a total nerd, but if there's something called an antipode, it's the opposite side of the planet. If you take the opposite side of Jerusalem, it's someplace in the Pacific Ocean, but it's the exact same latitude that runs through Alaska. So if you were to define the ends of the earth, Alaska is a very good candidate.
That's a great way of viewing that. So I think like seeing the global diaspora, the way in which in our present day moment that God has dispersed the peoples, all peoples of all ethnicities across the world, and seeing mission as not just going to where they are, but seeing them where you are, and engaging them in that kind of way. And so I think Changepoint has been looking at ways to try to engage that in a multi-ethnic kind of way. One of the things that I've been trying to encourage road system churches as I've communicated this kind of like, how do you reach people where you are? And then specifically Alaska churches, how do you view your engagement of rural Alaska? Is one, I really like the phrase describing owning lostness. So as a church, and you're driving to church, and right before you get to church, you pass a subdivision, and to ask the question, God said to go and make disciples of all people. Who owns the lostness of that subdivision? In other words, like when you stand before God and He says, "Hey, I want a disciples made in that neighborhood," who's going to be guilty of disobeying God because of that thing? And every church could say like, well, that other church down the road, they're actually closer to them, so that really is their thing. But there better be some peoples that we're like, nope, that's our responsibility in that kind of a situation. So seeing yourself as a church, not just as a holy huddle or a collection of believers that are just carrying on a tradition of some religious experience or whatever, but to see themselves as the tip of the spear wherever they are for gospel presentation, I think is critical. But one of the things I've been encouraging folks to think about in the rural context is saying, I think it's fascinating that a lot of our church members, even here at Changepoint or any other little church in Alaska, go out to rural Alaska for jobs, meaning like their job sends them out there to go do a construction project or go work at the clinic or go, do an evaluation for the school that's out there or all those kind of things. And it's crazy because it is a secular institution that's paying them and paying for their trip and paying for their lodging and all of those kind of things. and saying, how are we training our people to see themselves as frontier missionary engagement of saying, go in there and do that job, but go in with the lens in your eyes of saying, God, you've put me in this place to say, where, are there any believers that are here? Can I build a relationship with anybody? And wouldn't it be cool if this little bitty church that empowers their people to do that, and all of a sudden they realize, like, wow, we've got like 7 connections at Tyonic. What?
Yeah.
How? What in the world? What is that? God, are you doing something in us to say, what can we as a church do to engage in that place?
I love that because, and that's something I've been convicted of lately. It's because we're always looking out, or when I was young, it was like, one day I'll be a missionary and then I'll be sharing the gospel while neglecting the guy right next to me.
Right, yeah.
And we think when we get there, then we're going to show all this fruit when we're not doing it right now.
Right.
And even just the way we live, like you said, you have a plumbing project or a housing project out in a village and you don't really think, it's not on your radar. I'm just going out to do a job. And it's right there in front of you.
And it costs the church nothing. It costs us nothing.
If
we could engage them on that, we don't have to increase budgets. We don't have to raise funds, nothing. It's
And that matches our Western value of efficiency.
That's
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we'll just end with this one last question, which is thinking about the missionaries that are currently in the villages. I've spoken with many of them. They feel fruitless. Many of them struggle with anxiety, depression. Yeah. They're tired. Yeah. They're kind of looking for an excuse to come out for a vacation or something, and which they should be able to do. Right? Yeah. But what would you say? You were in Galena after 12 and a half years. What kept you going? What's an encouraging word for these folks?
Yeah, I would say two things. One was a bit of wisdom that an older missionary lady gave me probably 10 years ago. She said, we always long to see our efforts, be like a fruit-bearing tree that's bearing more fruit, right? Like that's what we always long to see. And a lot of times, rural Alaskan missions looks like you're staring at a brown field trying to find something green, and when you're in the midst of that, to say, reevaluate what is it that you're, what are those measures of success? Of saying, did you have a pleasant conversation with your neighbor in the village? Man, count that as much of a gospel win as baptizing somebody, because that's a hard fought win. And so, just looking for those measures of green, I think are ways in which we can, be encouraged. And then the last thing was just a clarity of, I think the words of Jesus when he gave the parable of the talents. And sometimes when you get flung to these far places like that, and you're just like, wow, am I just spinning my wheels? Am I actually accomplishing anything? And just realizing that the words of the master to the servant of both the 5 talent and the 10 talent guy were exactly the same. And he didn't say to them, well done, good and successful servant. He said, well done, good and faithful. And he is much more concerned with our heart, attitude, and faithfulness than he is about our output. Because he said, if you abide in me, you'll bear much fruit, and apart from me, you can do nothing. And so it really is just about us abiding in him and being obedient to the very simple and complicated task of telling people about Jesus.
Yes. I like the way you phrase that, simple and complicated task. And I like that concept of changing a definition of fruit. It's saying, I had a pleasant conversation about the weather with a guy, my neighbor, and say, hey, that was fruit, because you deepened your relationship in that moment. Yeah, I like that perspective, because that conversation is not going to look flashy in a newsletter, but it will in the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, God's paying attention. Your supporter might not be.
Yes. And that, of course, is our motivation, or it should be at least.
Yes, it should be. It should be.
Chris, thank you so much for this time. This was very insightful for me. As I said, I'm still a relative newbie to Alaska, and I'm learning from guys like you. So thank you very, very much for taking this time and inviting me to come over and record with you.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thanks so much.
You bet.